Good afternoon. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to visit with all of you over the next couple of, I almost said a couple of hours, but over about probably the next 45 or 50 minutes would be a bit more accurate. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Gustafson. I've worn a lot of different hats at McPherson College and currently work in the area of alumni and advancement, but my discipline, my passion area has always been music. And if we look back into the early history of humankind, to the paintings within the cave dwellers, we would see depictions showing that people sang, danced, and played very primitive instruments. Or if one were to go to the Kansas City Art Museum, the Nelson Atkins, one would see Greek vases, often with pieces of music notated. And did you know, and I'll say this, some of you know me as an organist, that we know that in 2500 BC, Cedars, a Greek engineer, actually created a very primitive version of the pipe organ. And if you were to go into Roman times, to the gladiator arena, again, there was a type of organ that was used during the gladiator fights. So the idea of an organ at the ballpark is not necessarily something new, but rather something that goes back for a significant amount of time in terms of humankind and culture. We have that desire to communicate, that desire to seek beauty. Now, how did this program come about? Well, I can't take all of the credit. It goes back to the 1980s in a conversation over a cup of coffee that took place with me, Rick Tyler, who teaches theater at McPherson College, and Susan Dodson, who was then chair of the art department. And in that conversation, we discovered there were so many overlaps, so many similarities between the three different art forms that Susan had the idea, why don't we create an introduction to the fine arts class? And she and Rick would probably have pushed it even a little bit further and would have suggested that perhaps we'd do some cooperative teaching in terms of the history of our various areas. Again, because there are so many connections across the art forms. So, late 80s, we developed a course entitled Introduction to the Fine Arts. It was a class that focused on the integration of music, art, theater, and film. We taught that class until Susan Dodson left in 1996, and Rick Tyler and I carried it forward into the early 2000s. As the college restructured in 2008-2009, Rick and I took that same concept and this time developed a course entitled Introduction to the Performing Arts, another general education class that really focused on the integration of music and theater. What we found as we were working with students is that they typically did not have the vocabulary of the four different discipline areas. And if you don't have that very basic vocabulary, it becomes challenging to talk about the art forms in an intelligent manner. Therefore, Susan would do an introduction on the language of the visual arts, I am music, and Rick would do one on film and theater. And so as we start talking about melody today, one of the 6 major elements of music, that becomes the plot in the film. It can be the conceptual design in the visual arts. And if one were to take the elements of music, art, and theater, line them up, one would see very interesting cross-disciplinary connections. Today we're going to focus on the elements of music, and I'm going to lift up 6. The 3 primary ones would be melody, harmony, and rhythm, followed by tempo, timbre, and dynamics, or volume. To lots of you, this is going to be old hat. You know absolutely everything that I'm going to be talking about, but hopefully you'll be enlightened in one way or another as we move through the six elements. I've at your table, if you have any trouble reading this overhead, and I teased Chris Whitaker when I came in today, I said you can tell I'm an old guy because I use old technology, a piano and an overhead projector. But the outline is more or less than anything else a guide to try to keep me on track and not talk too long. When we talk about melody, we're discussing the horizontal element of a musical composition. And the definition that I've given you is a succession of musical tones that is usually singable and memorable. You know the Mozart melody. Most of us learned it as a child. Singable, memorable, compared with... I dare you to sing that back, but Doris could probably do it. I tease you. Singable and memorable. It's been described in a lot of ways. The soul of music, the musical line that guides us through a work. Take, for example, Beethoven's Ode to Joy from his Ninth Symphony. That melody keeps recurring throughout the symphony and in a lot of different clothes, so to speak. But it's always recognizable, it's singable, and it is memorable. Rick Tyler likes the idea that it's the plot, it's the theme, it's what holds the work together. And many of you will recognize the name of Aaron Copland, great 20th century musician and composer. He said, the melody is generally what the piece is all about. And I like that because it's simple, straightforward, and to the point. What we don't often do is take a look at what makes up a melody, what makes one different from another. Very simply, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Let's take Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Beginning. We take a breath at that point as we're singing it in church. The middle. We also hear tones in relationship to each other. Again, I did this example a little while ago. We don't feel a sense of relationship. However, there would be composers in the 1960s and 70s, that great time of experimentation, who were trying to break out of these bounds, and they would argue, yeah, that is a melody, but it's probably not what most of us think of. If I were to do this, you want that melody to go where? Elsie is, if I were to keep doing that, you would probably be a little bit irritated because you have that sense. Let's take another melody. Hear that relationship of one note to another. From a hymn that is very common in many of our church hymnals. Melodies have a climax tone, the highest tone and the lowest tone. Let's look at the opening phrase of Joy to the World. It's an unusual melodic shape in that it begins with what? The climax point or the highest note. It ends with the lowest. However, for those people who analyze the shape of what melodies look like, more typically we start with the anticlimax note, that low note, toward the beginning and the end, and the higher notes occur very often in the middle, so that one has kind of that bell-shaped curve. Let's take this hymn. Starts, here's the middle of the melody. Climax note, anticlimax. And what makes melodies interesting is that no one is like another. It's that shape, the placement of the climax, the anticlimax note that makes it interesting. Melodies move by step or by leap. If you could see the piano keyboard up here, two keys that are adjacent to each other in the piano, if we move from one to the other, that's movement by step. Here's an example. I think you'll know the piece. In that melody, there is only one skip. And of course, if a melody is two adjacent notes, a skip would be anything else. Persons often struggle at an athletic event to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. Two reasons. One, because it's high. Personally, I think it works a whole lot better if it's played by a band as opposed to being sung. But the other piece is it's full of skips. It's an instrumental melody as opposed to a vocal melody. Big skips, wide skips, certainly less singable in terms of its structure. Melodies are based upon scales. Now, if I were teaching a music appreciation class, I would probably start back historically with some of the old scales that were used by the monks in the monasteries, what we call the church modes or the church scales. But today we essentially have two scales, the major scale, the minor scale, coming from the Latin word scala, which means ladder. So if I play the scale in D, major scale, it feels like a ladder. One is ascending, rung by rung. And it has a particular order of whole and half steps that's common to the major scale. But that major scale tends to connote what? Happiness, brightness. Let me play a hymn in D major using that scale. Scales of vocabulary, those 7 notes from which the composer works. And of course, I've added a little bit of harmony in there as well. Scales can be minor. Here's a scale in D that is a minor scale. And I remember when my kids were small and the Count appeared on Sesame Street. And the Count would sing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Darker would be a word we could use. Somber. You hear that flavor of the minor scale. Has a different flavor than major. Melodies can be fast or slow. Dance. And some of our early church music writers used to say, why should the devil have all the good music? Compare that with this tune. Feel the slowness of the music, melody. And one can't think of singing Abide With Me. It just wouldn't be right in terms of giving full justice to the text. And that's one of the other things that has taken place within the evolvement of music. Prior to really the development of the German Protestant Reformation tradition, and essentially really not probably until about the year 1600. Up to that point in history, lots of times music was considered more integral than text. And so we find some melodies that were written primarily within the Roman Catholic tradition in the Middle Ages, Reformation period, where you might have multiple melodies, including a popular folk tune stuck in, but one typically couldn't understand the words just because there were so many melodies going at the same time. However, when the Reformation occurs, and the introduction of hymn singing to the congregation takes place, there the primacy of the text rises to the top. And the important piece is music becomes the servant of the text. And of course that plays out in terms of melody as well. Well, let's go back to music history. I talked a little bit ago about the Greeks, and let's specifically focus on the Christian era, after the birth of Christ. Did you know that up until approximately the 9th century, most of the singing that people did was what? A single melodic line. I bet you'll recognize this Advent tune. Now I'm playing it in the style that would have been played in the 9th century. It wouldn't have been as neatly metered out as we find it in our hymnals today. However, monks have always been known for their ingenuity. And someone around the 19th century said, we've got high voices and low voices among us males. And wouldn't it be fun if the high voices sang the melody at a higher pitch and the lower voices sang it at a lower pitch, but we both sing the same melody at the same time. So this is what they came up with. First harmony, because we have two horizontal lines of music going at the same time, doing exactly the same thing. Or they might, instead of 5 notes apart, which I just did, what happens if we do it 4 notes apart? And we say that sounds weird. But it was the advent of the first harmony. Well, how do we define harmony? But again, using an art term, harmony adds the dimension of musical space. And if we look for a definition, any simultaneous combinations of sounds. These usually combine to form chords. So, primitive, or at least we would describe it as primitive, sounds of the monks in the 9th, 10th century. Well, what happens? Well, probably the first harmony might look something like this. We have a melody and a very simple harmony part. Is it more interesting? I hope so. Otherwise, I didn't do a very good job of demonstrating. And ultimately, we see the development of chords. What I played for you first was an illustration of an element of harmony called the interval. An interval is simply the distance between two notes. If I played this interval, They're 4 notes apart, called the interval of a fourth. You would recognize it in, I think everybody catches that tune pretty quickly. That's called a melodic interval. If I played it, the 2 notes at the same time, it's a harmonic interval, or 7 notes apart. Recognize that piece from the 1960s. So melodic interval, where 1 note follows the other. Harmonic interval, where they're both played at the same time. Anything larger than 2 notes is defined as a chord. So here's a very simple chord, or series of chords. Just simple 3-note chords. Or, if I wanted to jazz it up a little bit, or do that with students if it looks like they're falling to sleep in the back row. But that still fits the definition of a chord. 3 or more notes sounding at exactly the same time. And eventually, we find chords coming about in the history of music that were built on intervals of a third. First 2 notes are 3 notes apart. The upper 2 notes are 3 notes apart. So now I come back to our medieval tune with 3-note chords. It sounds a whole lot more familiar. But that probably wouldn't have happened into the history of music until probably about the 16th or the 17th century, and has stayed in place up until the current time. We need the feeling of movement. And you often look at a piece of artwork and you can perceive the artist's perception of the clouds moving across the sky. So we want music to move us forward in time and space. And that means that there has to be a relationship that takes place within the harmony. Let's go back to Beethoven's Joyful, Joyful, We Adore You. Actually, I'm going to do something different first. Let's just do this. I'm going to play a series of chords that are disjointed and have little relationship to each other. Doesn't really move, does it? Let's take Joyful, Joyful, We Adore You, just the first phrase. Now, what makes it move is the question. Let me ask this question. We've got some theater folks in the room. And if Tyler were here, he would say, what is the most critical element of theater? What has to be there above all else, or you ain't got none? What is it? What has to be in that script? What has to be there? Is everything always hunky-dory? No. You have to have emotion, conflict. Conflict is critical. Look at almost any television show that you watch. You set up the conflict and you resolve the conflict. The same thing takes place. Rick would also tell you that theater is a willing suspension of disbelief. As we're watching that television show or movie, that may not happen in real life, but we believe it's real as we're watching it at that given point on our television set. Well, music does the same thing with 2 big words, consonance and dissonance. Consonance means the relaxation of tension. You're at ease. You're at peace. If I just play this chord, consonance. But what about this? You want it to do what? You want it to move on, don't you? You don't want to sit there. That's dissonance or tension. Relaxation, relaxation, tension, relaxation, tension, partial tension, setting up more tension. And you can feel the tension, the relaxation of the tension as we play around with it. So, does that kind of make sense? Very critical elements. Melody, harmony. There's a third one. So I'm going to have some fun with you and see if you do exactly what my students do. I'd like you to take just a minute at your table, and one person be the recorder, and you tell me what rhythm is. And one person needs to read it back to me. Okay. Lois, you've been writing back here. What did your group say rhythm is?
Okay, we said a beat.
The beat, okay. That's the most common answer I hear. What does this table say?
We had Doris, so relationship in time between two or more elements.
Yes, you had Doris with you. What does this group say?
We have an underlying pattern.
Underlying pattern or pulse, maybe. Okay. What about over here?
The rhythm of the speed.
The rhythm of the piece. Yeah, it's certainly an interest element, isn't it? Any takers here? Beat. Okay. And I don't want to leave out this group over here.
Best we came up with was beat, flow.
Okay. Everybody has touched on elements of rhythm. And Doris's group has the correct answer. Here's what I do with my students, because they're usually not as perceptive as you. I'm going to take this old gospel hymn. You'll recognize it immediately. And I'm going to play it minus rhythm. So if Laurie Kitzel were here, and some of you know him, he would say that would sound pretty B-flattish. Meaning, not very interesting, not very interesting. Did that have a beat? It sure did. Now, watch what happens. Watch what happens when we have longer note values and shorter note values, and they're combined. Now let me play a little bit with the harmony. Jazz it up a little bit. I can't help but think of former student, one I'm very proud of. Nick Griggs teaches over at McPherson High School. And as the McPherson College Choir would go out to churches to sing, he said, "Oh, as I listen to those hymns, they sound so white." And so white. They sound so white. And Nick was wonderful at improvising at the piano, and actually still is. So that combination of long and short values, that's the rhythm. Now we certainly have a beat. 1, 2, 1, 2. I mean, that recurring pulse. That's typically what most of us think of when we come to the concept of rhythm. We also, and Doris's group said this, it's an organization of a pattern of beats that gives a certain continuity to our musical composition. So we typically feel things in 2 or threes or fours. And there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, that's true. That march I just played was clearly duple. You heard 2. 1, 2, left, right, left, right, left. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Or if I go to our friend Johann Strauss, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Ein, zwei, drei, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You feel the threes very, very clearly. Majority of our church hymns are in a quadruple meter. That means we feel fours. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And my brother and friends don't like when I mess up the harmony because it makes it difficult to sing in 4 parts. So I try to be careful. Okay. It would be pretty hard to conceive of music in today's world without melody, harmony, and rhythm. I call them, as I talk with students, the big 3. Yet there are 3 other elements that very much impact the quality of our musical experience. Tempo, musical pace, something that everybody knows about. But when we talk about the rate of speed at which a piece of music is performed, the performer is typically guided by some tempo markings. And I've given you some of the Italian terms. Italian is the international musical language used across the world for giving musical direction to the performer, and that's extremely helpful. So the term largo, very, very slow, broad. Oops, try that again. That really slow pulse that helps define the piece that you're listening to. Or recognize that theme from public television, the Murray tune, but bright, lively, spirited. Again, it impacts the quality of the musical experience. This is my bias. My first church job was in 1964, so I've either been a church organist or choir director now for 52 years. And nothing drives me crazier than to go to a church where I hear the organist do this. Played the same way as that dance tune. So, again, it's that primacy of the text. If I were going to be playing Ferris Lord Jesus, and I were looking at that text line, I wouldn't go, Ferris Lord Jesus. Tempo's important. It can have an impact on interpreting the textual and musical thoughts as they play into the theme of the worship experience that we have on Sunday morning. And typically, a lot of our church hymns are at a moderate tempo, giving persons time to breathe at the end of phrases. And people ask me sometimes, well, why do you sing along as you play on a Sunday morning? Well, perfectly good reason. I have to breathe just like the congregation. That organ's wind is generated by an electric motor. It can go on without breathing. But when I feel where in the text that breath should come, I put that breath in there. And so sometimes we play with tempo just a little bit because we've got to support the people's music, the congregational hymn, and persons need that opportunity to breathe. Elements of dynamics, musical volume. That one's easy. It's very self-explanatory, and we have some very basic Italian language. I think most of you learned in public school music that the F stands for forte, the P for piano, meaning soft. Mezzo is medium. So we have a little scale here of very soft up through very loud. And I think I've got a pen with me here. I realized after I had put this together, good. One overhead projector pen. I had left out something that's pretty critically important. That means to crescendo or get what? Louder, less than sign, to diminish, or to get softer. But dynamics can have a wonderful sense of feel when combined with tempo to express, I'll use Ellie's word over here, emotion. And music needs to connote feeling. And when it doesn't, we don't often connect with it. But take this very simple Chopin prelude. Start softly. Begins to crescendo to get louder. I can't talk, I lose my place. Now, without the dynamics and that particular tempo and the minor key that Chopin has chosen, the quadruple meter, fairly standard harmony, full chords, that piece would not communicate with the listener in the same sort of way. Little side story. Most of you are familiar with state music contest. You have an event at the regional level, and then you go to the state level. I was a ninth grader at McPherson Middle School, and I don't remember who my piano teacher, it was Eunice Tarum. My piano teacher was Eunice Tarum at that particular life, and Donna Burkholder over here was one of my early piano teachers, and Doris, my first choir director when I was in grade school. That aside, though, I played Chopin's Polonaise Militaire. Etc. Got my critique sheet back from the judge, and he said, "Steve, is there any dynamic other than loud?" And I had a 3 rating, not because of technical, because there were no dynamics in there, and he said it was not at all musical. And I've never forgotten that, but the role of that dynamics can play again in the musical experience. I want to try to wrap up in the next 5-6 minutes and then see if there are questions that you have. This last word is one that we don't encounter too often, and my students call it timber, as if a tree were being felled in the forest. But the musical name is timbre. timbre is color or quality of sound. So let's go back to some high school or college physics, where you may have studied a little bit of principles of sound. Now, try to keep this pretty simple. If I play a note on the piano, and I'm going to play a C down here, that's the fundamental. That's the C-ness. That is what you hear. That's C. Yet, sound is made up of composites of sound. And so when I play the fundamental, you hear also a tone, and I'm going to demonstrate this in a moment, an octave or 8 notes higher. You hear the 12th, the 15th, the 17th, 19th, and I could keep going. So here's our little exercise. And I said if you were a class, I would probably lift up the lid, invite the class to come up around the piano. Here's the C. When I play that C, a hammer strikes the string, and there's a damper on top of it that is raised and allows the string to vibrate. Eventually the sound will decay or go away because the string discontinues to vibrate. However, and don't ask me this because I'm not a physicist in any way, shape, or form, but in terms of the physics of sound, I am going to depress that C key silently. What's happening is that string in the piano case is free to vibrate. The damper is lifted. I'm going to very quickly play the note 8, 12, 15, 17, and 19 above it. And listen to what happens. I'm going to play those notes very quickly, and as soon as I let go of them, that string is dead. It's not sounding anymore. Now, where's that sound coming from? Those are sympathetic vibrations off of that low C string. So here's our fundamental. Put the key down silently. Play those same tones again. Now, we lose a lot the higher we go. But people who deal with the physics of sound have looked at that spectrum of sound and figured out all the different components of it. And that's what gives a sound color. Those of you who play the piano, and there are quite a number who do in here, if you depress the pedal on the right, it lifts all the dampers within the case, so all the strings are free to vibrate. And when we teach beginning piano, we tell the students we use that to connect sounds. Like such. However, let me take a medieval tune. And I'm going to keep the damper pedal down, which means the strings are vibrating. Lift it. Hear the interesting color of sounds. That's one string reacting against another. Why does an oboe sound different from a clarinet? And this is when, if I were at the college, we would go into the choral rehearsal room where there's a pipe organ, and having a little mini orchestra makes this very, very easy to demonstrate. But the quality or the color of sound is impacted by the material out of which an instrument is made. So a brass instrument is going to sound much different than a clarinet or an oboe, which both are made of wood. The shape of the instrument is going to have an impact. Let's take that oboe. It's a cylindrical pipe, essentially. You have a column of air which vibrates, and we stop that air, but the oboe essentially has a lot of the fundamental and the 12th in it. It gives it that particular color of sound. Now, if I will add, the 12th and the 17th in there, then I have a clarinet. Because it's those partials, those parts of a sound, that are heard in there. So that color of sound really helps pull that together. So with that point, let me stop and see what questions there might be. I've rattled on for about the last 50 minutes, so I'm used to that in terms of a classroom. Doris?
Not a question, just an addition. Since you include dance in some of this discussion, when you talk about the dynamics in dance, you're talking about the size.
Right.
I just want to throw that in.
Right, absolutely. I'm glad to have this opportunity. Carlene is at a family reunion in Indiana. The Morphew family is getting together, so she's not here at this point, and she'll be joining some of us at NOAC next week. And several of you have asked, well, would you do one of these? And I think most of you know that I plan to retire from McPherson College in 1st of January. And so I've always kind of held off doing it, thinking that somebody was going to get sick or back out at the last minute. But McPherson College faculty are incredibly healthy, and that's never happened over the years we've had this programming. So appreciate the opportunity to share.
What's happening to church music now? What do you see happening?
I think it depends where. It's a wide open question. It has become such a divisive issue in some congregations that they have split. What's interesting is that if one were to want to build a pipe organ today and order it, there are enough churches wanting it that you typically have to wait 2 or 3 year waiting period. And I think church music has been influenced by a number of things. Organists are as scarce as hen's teeth right now, and I think primarily for 2 reasons. One, when I was growing up, women did not have the opportunity to be involved in sports, with the exception of maybe a summer softball program. So there were a lot of women who really developed tremendous skill and expertise on the piano, which put them in good stead. The other thing, too, that I think has happened historically has been the number of women who have returned to work. That many church organ positions were held by women who were at home, and for many persons who work a full week, they don't want to be tied down every time the door is open. So I think that's had an impact on the keyboard. It's also had an impact in the church in terms of looking at some alternatives in terms of forms of musical accompaniment. I think a pendulum swings. If you look at what happened in the Roman Catholic Church following Vatican II in 1962, and services went to English, music became very contemporary, and they were really the first ones who had the concept of the praise band within worship. But if you look at what's happened in Catholic churches and music and hymnody, there's been kind of a pullback within the pendulum to what I would call a blended form of worship. And I really think that, particularly in a lot of small rural communities, that's the direction at which things are going to go. Now, I don't know if my kids are good people to ask, but they say music is a dimension of my worship experience, but I'm not going to choose a church because it has a very contemporary style of worship with a praise band or a very traditional style of worship. I have a friend who lives in a retirement community very similar to the Cedars campus in Evanston, Illinois, Presbyterian. It's Knox Presbyterian Village. Her church in Evanston chooses to do traditional worship and do it well, and they're the fastest growing church in the Chicago metro area. So, Presbyterian church, I should say. So it's kind of all over the board, and I think we're in the process of finding it. And I'll close with just one story that's very relevant to me. My mother grew up in Sylvan Grove, Kansas. She went to Lutheran parochial school for her first 8 years. She was required in grade school to memorize a German hymn or German chorale in English, every verse. Well, she had Alzheimer's for 10 years, and when she go to church, she couldn't tell you her name, she couldn't tell you her age, but she could absolutely every verse of these hymns. And I went to a number of workshops over the years up at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, with Renee Clausen, who is one of the small college choral directors recognized internationally. And he tells the same story about his mother. And one of the things I worry about in terms of today's student church population, what are going to be their touchstones? What are they going to be able to hang on to? When my mom was here at the Cedars and would become agitated, we would play a traditional hymn. You could just see her physically relax. She would respond to that stimulus when she would respond to nothing else. So I would tell my college choir students, I said, like it or not, every semester you're in the McPherson College Choir, you are going to learn one hymn setting, and that hymn is going to be memorized. So the point that you're dealing with difficulties later in life, maybe you'll have 8 hymn touchstones that will be a point of comfort that you can relate to. And as I look at my mother, the last 2 years she's pretty well non-communicative, but about the only thing she would respond to would be a hymn and the Lord's Prayer. Those two pieces. So enough said about that. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon, for your attention, and have a good one. See you next time.